When she returned to her hometown, she hadn't expected much to change. She knew the whispers and the judgments would still linger, but she wasn't prepared for the weight of their eyes when they saw her. The disbelief was palpable. She had left years ago, her dreams dismissed as naive, her future uncertain. They all assumed she had failed, that she had faded into obscurity. But there she stood, in front of them, transformed. Not the girl they had once ridiculed, but a woman who had built something real, something successful. They didn't know it yet, but she was the owner of the most talked-about café in the city, a place they would never have expected to see her name attached to. The air around the table felt heavy with their unspoken assumptions, their quiet judgment. But tonight, everything would change. This dinner, this moment, would reshape how they saw her, how they saw the path she had chosen. No longer the daughter they had written off, she had created a life that not only defied their expectations, but also proved that she had found her own way, on her own terms. She knew this would be the night that would forever alter their perception of her. The girl they once dismissed was no longer invisible. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she was ready to show them exactly what she had built. Jessie stood at the entrance of her childhood home, her heart heavy with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. It had been years since she had last walked through that door, since she had left everything behind to chase a dream that now felt distant. The familiar scent of old wood and dust filled the air as she stepped inside, her eyes meeting her parents'. They were the same as she remembered, her father James, sitting at the kitchen table with his eyes glued to the newspaper, barely acknowledging her presence, and her mother Karen, who hadn't changed a bit. She was the same woman who had always believed that hard work and money were the only paths to success, who had ridiculed Jess's decision to leave college and return to Vermont. Jess's parents had never understood her choice, had never supported the idea of organic farming, a life they saw as a hopeless pursuit. "You could have had a future," her mother would say, her voice cold with judgment. "But you chose dirt." Jessie had heard it all before, her father's disapproving silence, her mother's cutting remarks. Their disappointment in her had only grown since she dropped out of college, a decision that felt so right for her at the time, but one that had led to isolation from them. Her dreams of building something real, something sustainable, were laughed at by the very people who were supposed to stand behind her. The whispers from the town were even worse. They called her naive, foolish, and unworthy. The weight of their rejection had always lingered, a constant ache that fueled her need to prove them wrong. But as she stood there, feeling the eyes of her parents on her, it was impossible not to feel the sharp sting of their disbelief. Their faces were set in the same expressions of quiet disapproval that had greeted every one of her choices. To them, she was still the girl who had thrown away a future for the unglamorous life of a farmer. But Jessie knew that she was not the same person who had left that house all those years ago. She had found her purpose, even if it wasn't the one they had imagined for her. The pain of their rejection still echoed in her heart, but it no longer defined her. In the silence that filled the room, she realized that her success would not come from their acceptance. It would come from the path she had built for herself. Jessie had no illusions about the difficulty of her new life, but she was determined. She had sold every last penny of her savings, drained her bank account for the chance to make her dreams a reality. Renting a few acres of land in the rolling hills of Montpelier, she began the long, grueling process of transforming the land into something that could sustain her. The first few months were nothing but struggle. The trailer she lived in was cold, barely adequate, and filled with the scent of damp wood. She was alone, isolated but resolute. The days blurred together as she worked from dawn until late at night, her hands covered in dirt, her body weary from the constant labor. She tended to the soil, carefully planted organic vegetables and fruit trees, learning by trial and error. Her meals were simple, and luxuries were non-existent. The few possessions she had were secondhand, and there were moments when the silence of the land felt like an oppressive weight. Yet Jessie refused to succumb to the loneliness. She knew she was building something important, even if it meant working 16-hour days in the cold and the mud. She spent her nights poring over market research, learning about organic farming, sustainable practices, and the art of running a business. She read every book she could get her hands on, memorizing every detail, formulating a plan for the future. There were setbacks, of course. Many of her crops didn't take, and the work never seemed to get easier. But in the quiet moments, when she sat on the edge of her farm watching the sunset, Jessie felt a glimmer of hope. This was real. Slowly, her hard work began to pay off. Word spread about the small farm, and she started to get visitors, people interested in the produce she was growing. Local businesses began to buy from her, and she started getting offers for partnerships. Inspired by the growing interest, she decided to open a small café, a place where people could experience the farm-to-table food she had worked so hard to cultivate. The café was modest, with mismatched furniture and a rustic charm that reflected Jess's journey. It wasn't long before it became a gathering spot for those who appreciated good, honest food. The once quiet farm now buzzed with activity, and Jessie felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she watched the café grow. The dream that had once seemed impossible was becoming a reality, and it was all thanks to the long hours, the sweat, and the belief that she could turn dirt into something beautiful. Jess's café had gained a steady stream of customers, the small but intimate space filled with the warm hum of conversation and the smell of freshly prepared meals. Slowly, her dream was taking shape, and she could feel the weight of her hard work paying off. But despite the growing popularity, doubts still lingered, quietly whispering in the back of her mind. The small successes weren't enough to drown out the years of ridicule, the voices that told her this was just a fleeting moment. It wasn't just the past that haunted her. The people who had once known her, those from her childhood, continued to watch from the sidelines, convinced that her business was a passing fancy. They didn't believe in her longevity, and it stung. Some of them had even started showing up, offering polite nods but questioning her decision. To them, this was a novelty, not a real business. Jessie could feel their skepticism like a shadow, no matter how many smiles or compliments she received. One afternoon, as she prepared a new batch of heirloom tomatoes for the café's signature salad, a familiar face appeared at the counter. It was Charlie, an old friend of her father's, who had once been a constant presence at the family's holiday dinners. He smiled politely, his words sweet, but the underlying tone unmistakable. He mentioned how her father thought her café was just a place for farmers, a passing trend that would fade once the novelty wore off. The words struck her harder than she expected, but in that moment, Jessie realized something crucial. She had spent so much time worrying about what others thought, about proving them wrong, that she had lost sight of the most important thing. She was the one who needed to believe in her café. She had built it from the ground up, and no one else's doubts could define her success. Her mission wasn't to convince the naysayers, it was to make something lasting. Determined, Jessie decided to elevate her café to the next level. She would create a menu that paid homage to the local farms she supported, a menu that would stand as a testament to the integrity and quality of her work. It wasn't about impressing others anymore. It was about showing herself that her vision was strong enough to endure. She sourced the finest local ingredients and introduced new dishes that celebrated the season's best offerings. The doubt didn't disappear overnight, but Jessie felt something shift inside her. She wasn't afraid of failure anymore, nor did she need approval. She was ready to prove, not to anyone else, but to herself, that this was more than a dream. It was her future. The café was her creation, her legacy, and it was going to thrive on her terms. Jessie had avoided her family for years, but when her sister Sarah called with an invitation to a family dinner at their old favorite restaurant, something inside her shifted. It wasn't the first time Sarah had asked her to come, but this time the invitation carried a different weight. Sarah was about to announce her engagement, and she wanted her whole family there. Despite the tension and history between them, the idea of seeing her family again, especially Sarah, made Jessie feel conflicted. Her past was still alive in every memory of this place, every moment spent there with them, but it had been so long since she'd seen them face to face. Jessie knew it wouldn't be easy, that her parents would still see her as the failure who had walked away from their expectations, but she decided to go, not to seek their approval, but because Sarah was important to her. She had made her peace with the fact that she would never fit their mold, but a small part of her still longed for connection. So with a deep breath, She slipped into the familiar comfort of the restaurant, its cozy lights and vintage decor all too familiar. The smell of rich wine and expensive dishes filled the air, but it was the faces of her parents that made her feel like she had never left. As she approached their table, she could see the uncomfortable silence in their eyes, a coldness that didn't surprise her. Her father, as usual, was absorbed in his glass of wine, and her mother gave a quick glance before returning to the menu, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of small talk. Sarah, on the other hand, was trying to make the best of the situation, but her comments couldn't help but carry the sharp edges of judgment. Every word Sarah spoke about Jess's life felt like a reminder of the past, of how Jessie had chosen to walk a different path, one that none of them could understand. Her sister made a few jabs about her simple life, about how Jessie was still in the farm business, as if it were a punchline. Despite the bite in her words, Jessie held her ground, feeling the familiar sting of being the odd one out. But this time, it didn't hurt as much. She was no longer the girl who needed their approval, the girl who hoped they would see her dreams as valid. Jessie had built her own world now, a world that was real and honest. And as the evening dragged on, she realized how far she had come. She wasn't the girl they had known before. She had created something true, something they still couldn't comprehend, and it no longer mattered. As Jessie sat at the table, the weight of her parents' presence felt like an old wound, one that never fully healed. Her father, after a long silence, cleared his throat and finally spoke, offering an apology for the harsh words he had said in the past. It was a moment she had imagined 1,000 times, the moment her father might finally recognize his mistake, but when it came, it was strangely hollow. The apology felt more like a formality than a genuine recognition of her struggles. Her mother's silence echoed louder than any words. There was no warm smile, no acknowledgement of the years that Jessie had spent carving her own path. They were still the same, judging, withholding, expecting her to follow a script she had long since abandoned. Jessie realized that this moment, this apology, wasn't going to heal the rift between them. Her father's words, although an attempt at reconciliation, couldn't erase the years of doubt, the years of being dismissed as the failure. And then, with a quiet but determined resolve, Jessie decided it was time to reveal her secret, the one that she had kept hidden, even from her own family, for far too long. With a steady voice, she told them that the café they had always mocked, the one they thought was nothing more than a fleeting hobby, was hers. She was the owner, the creator, the person behind the thriving business they had dismissed so easily. The truth hit them like a wave, and for a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. They couldn't believe it. Their daughter, the girl who had once walked away from everything they valued, had succeeded in ways they could never have imagined. At first, there was disbelief, followed by a flurry of questions and half-hearted attempts to rationalize the situation. They couldn't understand how she had turned something they had ridiculed into a success. But Jessie stood her ground, her eyes steady as she explained that her journey was not a coincidence. It was the result of years of hard work, sacrifice, and relentless belief in her vision. She had built this from nothing, piece by piece, with her own 2 hands. Her parents' confusion was palpable, but it didn't matter. In that moment, Jessie understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. Their approval was irrelevant. She had done it for herself, not for them. She had created something real, and that was all that mattered. As they sat there, still grappling with the truth, Jessie realized that her success was not just about the business. It was about freeing herself from their expectations, from the narrative they had tried to impose on her life. She was no longer bound by their vision of what she should be. She had built her own future, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her life. Jessie sat quietly at one of the tables in her café, the soft glow of the evening light casting long shadows on the wooden floors. The café was closed for the night, but the faint hum of the city outside felt distant, almost like it belonged to a different world. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup as she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. It hadn't been easy, and there had been countless moments when she wondered if she was making the right choice. But now, looking at the café she had built with her own hands, she felt a deep sense of peace. She hadn't needed the approval of others to succeed. For so long, she had measured her worth by the expectations others placed on her, especially her family. But now, Jessie knew that success didn't come from validation. It came from within, from the quiet conviction that she was on the right path, regardless of how others saw her. The cafe wasn't just a business. It was a testament to her strength, to her refusal to let anyone else define what her life should look like. As the night wore on, Sarah walked in, her familiar smile lighting up the room. They shared a quiet moment together, the noise of the world outside fading into the background. Sarah, who had once been skeptical of Jess's choices, now sat across from her, admiration in her eyes. She spoke of how inspired she was by everything Jessie had built, how proud she was of her sister's success. For the first time in years, Jessie didn't feel the need to explain or justify her choices. Her sister's words, while kind, didn't carry the weight they once would have. Jessie had already proven to herself that she had done the right thing. The evening stretched on, filled with laughter and quiet conversation, but even in those peaceful moments, Jessie knew she had finally come full circle. The world had once told her that she couldn't have what she wanted, that her dreams were foolish, but now she had built something that was more than just a business. It was her life, her dream realized. In the silence of that night, surrounded by the warmth of the cafe she had made her own, Jessie realized that the true measure of success wasn't in how the world saw her, but in the peace she now held within herself. She had built her future on her terms, and in doing so, she had found a harmony she had longed for all her life. There was nothing left to prove. She was exactly where she needed to be.